The moment I saw Dr. Helena Voss crying alone in the hospital chapel, I almost turned around and walked away. Not because I didn't care, because I had my resignation letter sitting in my bag, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to change my mind about leaving. It was the night of St. Mercy Regional's annual Founders Gala, the one event each year where the administration pretended the hospital was one big family, where surgeons clinked champagne glasses with custodial staff, and everyone smiled for photographs that would end up on the fundraising brochure. The kind of event where you dressed up and showed up and tried not to think about the 12-hour shift you'd just finished, or the one starting in 2 days. I almost skipped it entirely, but attendance was strongly encouraged, which at St. Mercy meant mandatory, so I put on the only blazer I owned and drove 20 minutes from my apartment in Clarksville to the Vandervale Ballroom downtown. My name is Ethan Morse. At the time, I was 28 years old, a second-year physician assistant in the cardiothoracic surgery unit, and I was 3 hours away from submitting my resignation to HR. Let me back up. I grew up in Billings, Montana. My family wasn't poor exactly, but we weren't comfortable either. My dad drove a delivery truck for a regional freight company, and my mom worked the front desk at a dental office for 17 years. They were the kind of people who never complained about long hours or difficult customers, who believed that showing up was its own form of dignity. When I got into PA school, my dad took a personal day, which I had never seen him do, and drove me to the airport himself. He shook my hand at the departure's door and said, "Make something worth making." I thought about that a lot during my first year at St. Mercy, because the work was worth making. The patients were real, the problems were hard, and the team was good. But my direct supervisor, Dr. Helena Voss, chief of cardiothoracic surgery, was a different story. Dr. Voss had a reputation that preceded her by about a decade. She had trained at Johns Hopkins, published over 60 peer-reviewed studies, and had performed more than 2,000 open-heart surgeries before the age of 50. She was brilliant in the way that very few people are brilliant, the kind of intelligence that looks less like a gift and more like a force of nature. Residents called her the wall behind her back. Not because she blocked them, but because no matter how hard you pushed, she didn't move. She wasn't cruel. She never raised her voice, never used sarcasm, never embarrassed anyone's in front of a patient, but she was cold in a way that went deeper than professionalism. She didn't ask how you were doing. She didn't acknowledge good work unless it was exceptional. And even then, the acknowledgement was clinical, adequate, acceptable. That will do. Her emails were 3 sentences at most. Her feedback was a list of errors with no commentary on what went right. For 9 months, I told myself it was fine, that this was how elite medicine worked, that people like Dr. Voss didn't have time for warmth because they were too busy saving lives, and that was a reasonable trade. Then the January rotation review happened. I had spent 6 weeks developing a revised post-op monitoring protocol for valve replacement patients, something I'd built from scratch after noticing a pattern in readmission rates that the existing checklist wasn't catching. I'd cross-referenced 3 studies, run the numbers, and stayed late for 2 weeks refining it. I brought it to Dr. Voss, expecting at least a conversation. She read it in 4 minutes, handed it back, and said there were structural gaps, no specifics, no suggestions, just structural gaps, and then she left for rounds. I went home that night and started writing the letter. I didn't finish it that night or the night after. I kept telling myself I'd sleep on it, keep trying, give it 1 more month. But the month passed and I was still invisible. So I finished the letter, printed it, folded it into my bag, and told myself I'd deliver it after the gala. The Vandervale Ballroom was everything. Mercy wanted it to be. Soaring ceilings, rounds of white tables with centerpieces that probably cost more than my monthly student loan payment, a live jazz quartet playing softly near the entrance. People clustered in groups the way they always did at these things. Surgeons with surgeons, nurses with nurses, administrators with administrators. The invisible architecture of a hospital, just wearing nicer clothes. Dr. Voss arrived 40 minutes after I did. I noticed because the room shifted when she walked in. Not dramatically, but perceptibly, the way a current changes when something large moves through water. She was wearing a dark burgundy dress, simple and understated, and her silver hair was down for the first time I had ever seen. She looked striking. She also looked like she was barely holding herself together. I don't know how I noticed it. Maybe because I'd spent 9 months studying her from a careful distance, learning to read the small signals she never intended to broadcast. The way she held her clutch too tightly, The way her eyes moved to the exit twice in the first 5 minutes. The way she accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and then didn't drink it, just held it like she needed something to grip. I kept my distance. I talked to a few colleagues, had a glass of wine, watched the room. The jazz quartet shifted to something slower and softer around 8 o'clock, and a few couples drifted toward the small dance floor near the far wall. That's when I noticed she was alone. Not just alone in the way you're alone at a party when you step away from a conversation, alone in the way that feels deliberate, like she had moved to a specific corner of the room specifically to be somewhere that no one would follow. She was standing near a floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city lights, and the expression on her face was something I had never seen from her before. She looked afraid. I still can't fully explain what happened next. I had a resignation letter in my bag. I had approximately zero relationship with this woman beyond a professional dynamic that made me feel small. Every rational soul part of my brain said to finish my drink and leave early, but something about the way she was standing, so deliberately still, like she was trying very hard not to fall apart, made me set down my glass and walk toward her instead. She didn't hear me coming. When I stopped beside her and said her name quietly, she turned with a small, startled movement that she immediately smoothed over. For a moment she looked at me the way she always looked at me, measuring, composed, slightly distant. Then I said something I hadn't planned. I told her the quartet had shifted to something worth dancing to, and I asked if she'd like to. The silence lasted long enough that I was certain she was going to decline. She was Dr. Helena Voss. She didn't dance with second-year PAs at hospital galas. This was going to be a graceful refusal and then a very long walk back to the other side of the room. But she didn't refuse. She looked at me for another moment, something moving behind her eyes that I couldn't read, and then she said quietly, "All right." We walked to the edge of the dance floor together, and when I offered my hand, she took it. Her grip was steady, but as we began to move slowly with the music, I felt it. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor in her hand, like someone who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time and was only now becoming aware of the weight. Neither of us spoke for a while. The music was slow and low, and people glanced at us the way people glance at something unexpected and then looked away. I focused on keeping our movement natural, unhurried, not making anything out of the moment that she hadn't consented to make. After a while, she exhaled, not dramatically, just quietly, like something releasing, and she said almost to herself, "This is the first time tonight I don't feel like I'm standing in front of a firing squad." I didn't respond immediately. I let the sentence sit there. Then she said, "I owe you an apology, Ethan." It was the first time in 9 months she had used my first name. I told her she didn't owe me anything. She shook her head slightly. "The protocol you submitted in January, the valve replacement monitoring revision." She paused. "I read it 4 times. I should have told you that." I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. "I told you there were structural gaps," she continued. "There weren't, not meaningful ones. I said that because I didn't know how to respond to the fact that a second-year PA had caught something our attendings had been missing for 3 years. I handled it badly." The jazz quartet shifted into something slower still, almost meditative, and the lights above the dance floor dimmed a degree or two. Around us the gala continued, the clink of glasses, the low hum of conversation, but it felt far away. I asked her what was happening tonight. I asked it carefully, not intrusively, leaving her room to deflect. But she didn't deflect. She told St. Mercy Regional had been in quiet negotiations for 8 months with Cartwright Health Systems, a large regional network looking to acquire the hospital and absorb it into their 9-facility operation. The board had been optimistic. The terms were favorable. The deal would have meant capital investment, expanded services, and job security for nearly 1,100 employees. That afternoon, Cartwright had walked away, not because of finances, not because of the facility, because of a report, an internal performance review commissioned by the board that had flagged Dr. Voss's department specifically. The report cited communication deficits, retention problems, and what it delicately described as a leadership culture that may present integration challenges. 3 physician assistants had left her unit in the past 14 months. One had filed a formal grievance that was quietly resolved. Cartwright's acquisition team had seen the report and determined the risk wasn't worth it, the deal was dead. And Dr. Helena Voss, chief of cardiothoracic surgery at St. Mercy's Regional, was the reason. She said it without self-pity. That was the thing that got me. There was no performance in how she said it, no bid for sympathy. She laid it out like a clinical summary. Patient presented with this. Outcome was that. Prognosis unclear, but her hand was still trembling. I thought about the 3 people who had left. I thought about how invisible I'd felt for 9 months. I thought about the resignation letter folded in my bag. And I also thought about the Monday she'd come in at 5:30 a.m., when a post-op patient coded, how she'd been at the bedside for 6 hours straight without sitting down, how she'd cried in the hallway briefly when they lost him, and then gone back to the next patient before anyone could say a word to her. I thought about all the things she carried that no one in that room was allowed to see. I told her something I hadn't planned to say. I told her I had a letter in my bag, a resignation letter, that I'd been planning to deliver it to HR the following morning. She went very still. I told her I'd written it 3 weeks ago and spent 3 weeks trying to talk myself out of it, that I'd come to the gala tonight thinking I'd make my peace with leaving, and that I was sorry, not because I owed her an apology, but because somewhere in the past 9 months, despite everything, I had stopped being angry and started actually caring about the work we were doing, about the patients we were keeping alive. And I hadn't wanted to admit that because it was easier to leave if I stayed angry. The music faded into a quiet bridge, and we slowed almost to stillness. She looked up at me, and I had not in all my times at St. Mercy seen Dr. Helena Voss look uncertain. Not once. She had an answer for everything. She processed difficulty the way a machine processes input, cleanly and without visible cost. But in that moment, standing under the low lights of the Vanderveil ballroom, she looked uncertain in a way that was utterly human. She said, "Please don't go. Not please reconsider. Not we need your skills on the unit. Just please don't." Quieter. I know I've made it hard to stay. I know I'm the reason at least 2 of those people left, and I'll carry that. But I need you to know that I have never once, not once, been indifferent to your work. I just don't know how to say the things I should say. I've spent 30 years learning how to be excellent and no time at all learning how to be decent. And those are not the same thing, and I know that now. The music ended. We stood there for a moment in the fading quiet, and then the next song began and the room resumed its rhythm, and someone, across the room, laughed at something and the world came back. I didn't give her my answer that night. I told her I needed to think. She nodded and said that was fair, and I believed she meant it, and then we separated and went back to our own corners of the room, and I drove home at 10 o'clock and sat at my kitchen table and looked at the folded letter for a long time. The next morning I shredded it. I'm not going to pretend the following months were easy, because they weren't. St. Mercy went into something close to crisis mode after the Cartwright deal collapsed. The board commissioned an independent operational review. There were budget freezes, departmental restructuring discussions, and 3 consecutive all-hands meetings in which the word uncertainty appeared so many times it lost its meaning. But Dr. Voss changed. I don't say that lightly, because I've heard people say that about difficult supervisors before, and usually what they mean is, the person got marginally less hostile or learned to fake warmth for performance reviews. That wasn't what happened with Helena. What happened was quieter and more uncomfortable. For her, I think, more than anyone. She started asking questions, not rhetorical ones, not the kind that were really just corrections in disguise. Actual questions, posed in a way that left room for a real answer. She started holding 20-minute check-ins with the PA team on Wednesday mornings, which were awkward at first, because no one knew quite how to behave in a setting where Dr. Voss was actively soliciting their input. Slowly, they figured it out. Then they started looking forward to it. She called me into her office in February, about 6 weeks after the gala, and told me she had brought my valve replacement protocol to the department head with her formal endorsement. She had put her name behind it. It went to the quality committee the following week and was approved for a pilot implementation in March. She didn't make a big thing out of it. She told me the way she told me most things, concisely, without preamble. But before I'd left her office, she said, "Your father's advice was right, by the way, about making something worth making. You told me that once." I've thought about it a few times since. I hadn't remembered telling her that. I didn't even remember when I would have said it. But she had held on to it, and something about knowing that untangled a knot in my chest I hadn't realized was there. The pilot ran for 12 weeks. Readmission rates for valve replacement patients in our unit dropped by 19%. The protocol went hospital-wide in the fall. The Cartwright deal never came back. But 6 months later, St. Mercy entered a partnership with a different regional network, a smaller one, better aligned with the hospital's culture, with a leadership team that specifically cited the cardiothoracic unit's innovation track record as a factor in their interest. The board credited the department's performance improvements. Dr. Voss sent a single email to the unit that read, "This belongs to all of you." 3 people forwarded it to me. 2 of them had never sent me a casual email before. I've been at St. Mercy for 3 years now. I was promoted to senior PA 8 months ago, which came with a title and a modest pay increase, and the responsibility of helping orient new staff, which I'll admit is the part of the job I didn't expect to love as much as I do. There's something about watching someone new try to find their footing that makes you want to be the kind of person who helps them, instead of the kind of person who makes it harder. Dr. Voss is still chief of cardiothoracic surgery. She's still demanding and still brilliant and still capable of silencing a room with a single look. But people know something's about her now, too. She knows the names of the custodial staff on night rounds. She started a peer support program for early career clinicians after reading about burnout rates in a journal and deciding, apparently, that the hospital should do something about it. She leaves notes. Actual handwritten notes, which I'm told takes her significant effort because her handwriting is, by her own admission, terrible when someone does something she thinks deserves recognition. I kept the first one she left me. It said, in cramped and barely legible script, "The 7B patient asked me who designed the new monitoring protocol. I told her it was you," she said, and I quote, "Tell him thank you, he probably saved my life. Thought you should know. No signature, just that." I still have it folded in my desk drawer. Some mornings, when the shift is long and the unit is stretched thin, and I'm running on bad coffee and 4 hours of sleep, I open the drawer and look at it for a second, and then I go back out and do the work. Because sometimes that's what staying looks like. Not a grand decision made under ballroom lights. Just choosing again and again to keep showing up. And sometimes the bravest thing a person can do, especially a person who has spent 30 years being unreachable, is to stand in front of someone and say, plainly, without armor, "Please don't go." Those 3 words changed the direction of my life. I'm grateful I was there to hear them, and I'm grateful that I stayed long enough to understand what they cost her to say.